Hello everyone and welcome back to A Couple Books. This is Couple as per usual. It has been a extremely long time. Like, oh my god, it's been way too long. I promise you everything has been fine. It has just been a little too much of grad school and I want to make the best videos possible and I can't do that while also in grad school. So I'm almost out of grad school, so I'm getting back into filming now. And since it's been like 3 months since I last saw you guys, that means that I have read a few books. We'll just say a few. No questions, please. Hi, Nova. The dog has already returned. As you guys can see, we've had a little bit of a change in setup as well, but we can get into that later. Right now, I need to catch you guys up on what I've read. So since we last spoke, I have read a total of 50 books. I'm gonna subdivide them into the genres that I read, and I'm just gonna briefly talk about each. For the ones that deserve a more in-depth review, we'll be doing individual book reviews on, or duos or trios or something along those lines. I will cover it at a future point, but otherwise I just wanted to generally catch you guys up on what's been happening. Mrs. Nova Clark, you're fine. The first genre we're going to go through is going to be urban fantasy / fantasy. This has been by far the most read genre the last 3 months, and that was 32 books total, and those books were The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by Victoria Schwab. This was a historical, fantastical, fantasy romance story written by Victoria Schwab. It was like probably the biggest book, or one of the biggest books on BookTube and the world for a little bit, so I'm sure most of you guys have heard of it or read it yourself. But basically it's about this woman named Addie LaRue who made a deal with some sort of satanic creature to basically get out of a dead marriage, or not a dead marriage. She wanted to get out of the marriage, and so she was like, I don't want to get married to this dude, get me out of it. And the satanic dude was like, chill, let's do it. It's so chill. And then, JK, you're immortal now and no one can remember you. So happy immortality. So basically we follow Addie LaRue as she lives for hundreds of years, eventually runs into our best book seller bud in present day, and he ends up remembering her. So there ensues the romantical story. I personally was semi-intrigued to it, but didn't love it that much. So I read the Alex Verus series by Benedict Jacka. This is a urban fantasy Dresden Files lookalike, though it is in its own right a very fantastical story, and I really enjoyed it immensely. I read a total of 11 books within the series. I read Fated, Cursed, Taken, Chosen, Hidden, Veiled, Burned, Bound, Marked, Fallen, Forged. So I read those books. They're not super long or thick books by any means. They're like, I think 300 pages on average, maybe 400. And it's basically just an urban fantasy series as we follow a mage in the UK. And his mage's name is Alex, obviously, Alex Verus series. And Alex is a mage who is able to see into the future. And so basically within this magical community, everyone has specific magical abilities. It's not like you can do everything. You can only do the things that are within the scope of your mage powers, if that makes sense. So, for example, Alex is able to see probabilities of the future. So he's able to basically glimpse into the future, but not super far into the future, just moments, okay? Like, if he is going to walk down this path, is he going to get stabbed in the face? I don't know, let's go find out. If I walk down this path, will I also get stabbed in the face? Yes or no? And then he walks down that path, but in his head, and he's able to see it. So it's a very unique power. It seems kind of like a weak power, but it also reminds me of the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, when they take the metal that allows Vin to basically see probabilities of the future and what moves are going to make. So it does have very powerful utility, but in the general scheme of things, compared to being like a fire mage or like an ice mage or a water mage, it has less versatility, if that makes sense. But basically we follow him as he deals with having friends and enemies come after him. He's got the very standard stereotype dark mage master that trained him up and then disappeared, and so he's got that to contend with. He has a mage who has basically a magical disease that if anyone gets too close to her or touches her, they basically get super unlucky to the point that they die. And so he deals with that. And then of course there's just the general standard, you know, Alex versus the world kind of things going on in the story. I want to go more in depth into this series, which I will at a later date, but for now, you just need to know if you like Dresden Files, this is Dresden Files vibes hardcore, and it's also got a very unique magic system, and that magic system is very different from Dresden Files, and I supremely enjoyed it. And the books are fast paced. They're like 30-minute intense action quick book. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, moving on. It's a really good series, okay? I really enjoyed it. There was not a bad book in it. Then, of course, I also reread all the Dresden Files so that I could read the 2 newest additions to the Dresden Files, Peace Talks and Battleground. So, in total, I read Stormfront, Full Moon, Great Peril, Summer Night, Death Mass, Blood Rights, Deadbeat, Proven Guilty, White Knight, Small Favor, Turncoat Changes Ghost Story, Cold Days Skin Game, and those were all a reread. And then, of course, I read the 2 newest editions, which were one book eventually divided into 2, Peace Talks and Battleground, and I read them together because they were originally written together, so I felt that in order to get the full satisfaction from the story, I'm going to read it together, which is what I did. It was amazing, brilliant. For those who do not know, this is another urban fantasy series following Dresden, Harry Dresden. Harry Dresden is a PI, a private investigator for the Chicago Police Department, and he also works for himself, and basically he's also happens to be a wizard, and he's not secretive about this. He puts it in the yellow pages of the phone book, and he's in there, and he basically just goes around solving crimes. And the first few books are very urban detective fantasy-esque. Like, you know, Harry gets a dead body, and now he needs to figure out how did the dead body arrive there, and who caused the dead body to be at that present location. So the first few got that very standard setup and very standard arc where it's dead body shows up, Harry almost dies, Harry survives, Harry figures out who the bad guy was. So very non-unique in that sense. But what's amazing about it is that Jim Butcher, the author of the series, really builds Harry up. But by the newest books in the series, it is looking more like a grand epic fantasy series than just a standard detective urban fantasy noir series, if that makes sense. It's brilliant. Like, it really is. I cannot fault many things in the Dresden Files. Of course, I do have my least favorite books, which I will go over in another video, but overall, just perfection. I love this series. It's one of my all-time favorites. And if you're into any kind of wizardry, detective stuff, fantasy, urban settings, like, pick it up. Like, it really you can't go wrong with it. It was my introduction to urban fantasy, and I do not regret that. Lastly, I read I'm starting to reread Rick Riordan's Percy, Jackson, and Olympians series. I have read The Lightning Thief, Sea of Monsters, Titan's Curse. For those who are not aware, this was basically Harry Potter after Harry Potter, and it basically follows these kids who are half god, half immortal, and they are demigods and also known as half-bloods. And at the age of around puberty starting, they begin to give off a scent, basically a perfume to monsters that are seeking to destroy them and kill them. And so once they hit puberty, they usually most of the time either die or they get swept off to Camp Half-Blood, where they basically get trained in how to fight these monsters and how to defeat these creatures that are trying to kill them. And so most kids go there, they learn a few tricks, and then they go out into the world and continue to go to school and everything, and then just go back to Camp Half-Blood for the summers. And then other characters or other demigods, I should say, who are more powerful or come from more powerful heritage have to live there year-round. And basically we follow Percy Jackson. His father is unknown. We do not know which deity he belongs to or which deity he was sired from. And basically he is completely in the dark, and he basically learns that monsters are coming after him when a monster literally starts to come after him. And he basically runs, and his mom, realizing the situation, drives him to Camp Half-Blood, at which point something happens. I'm not going to say anything more. And he basically gets swept up into Camp Half-Blood, and from there, he basically learns how to fight, and he goes on quests. It's a fantastical journey. I love it. I'm so nostalgic for the series, and I'm loving every page of it, even though some of the text and dialogue is so awkward, and I'm like, is that how I spoke as a middle schooler? If so, cringe. But overall, utterly fantastic still, and I'm really enjoying rereading the series. So that was urban fantasy. Then I read 3 horror books. I read Ghost Finders by Adam McOmber, and it is a Victorian-like London-era detective noir, but with supernatural deities, and there's some weird stuff, and it basically follows this man who is a detective, as I said, and he basically is out there solving supernatural incidents. Like, he investigates them and figures out what's actually going on here. He has by his side a woman who is telekinetic. She's able to move things from her mind, and he also has his buddy bud who is basically super strong, and they basically just go out there and they solve supernatural mysteries. And basically in this story, it's a one-off story where something supernatural comes thumping, and him and his crew have to go out and basically investigate and figure out what's going on. I really did not like this book. It was not enjoyable. To me personally, I enjoyed the atmosphere of it very much so, and I thought the author hit it on the head with the atmosphere. It's just the actual storyline was extremely dull to me, and it did not have a satisfying climax or conclusion to me, to be honest with you, and overall was rather disappointed by it. But the atmosphere is what carried it, which is why I finished it and I didn't DNF it. The atmosphere was on point, like really well done, and I think, and I honestly do believe McOmber is onto something here with his atmosphere setting and his world building, and I think he could really eventually have a masterpiece. It's just the character and the storyline just needed a little bit more, but some of the characters were fantastic and the atmosphere was great. So very little complaints with regards to that. Then I read FantasticLand by Mike Bockoven. So that is basically Hunger Games combined with Hurricane Katrina. What do I mean by that? Basically, we are reading or listening, depending on how you take in your books. We are watching, reading, listening, whatever the preferred verb is, to interviews between basically investigators of what happened at this place called FantasticLand, which basically think Disney World or Disneyland. During a massive storm that swept across the coast, it caused flooding and all the standard things that you think of in natural disasters involving water. All of these people who worked at this Disneyland, at this FantasticLand, basically get stuck in there. And they can't get out because the entire amusement park has been flooded, and so basically there's no rescue coming anytime soon. And because they're at an amusement park where it is dry and they have access to food and other supplies, they are not at a high level priority for taking out. Does that make sense? For rescuing, I guess. So basically they're just kind of left to sit there and stew for a few days. The problem is that I guess this is a lesson in what not to do. You don't put a whole bunch of young adults, old teenagers into an amusement park with no supervision and little food in the midst of a national disaster, because apparently what they start doing is going full-on Hunger Games on each other and start killing and stabbing each other and dividing into groups, which is basically exactly what happens. All these kids, they basically divide up into groups based off where they worked or where they're located or their gender or whatever, or how psychotic they are, and they basically divide into groups and then they basically go around killing each other. And it's really grand and fantastic. It is completely outlandish in my personal opinion, but I enjoyed it. I loved it. It was a really fun story. It's fun. You're not in it because you believe it. You're in it because it's fun. And the interview style format of telling the story was intriguing enough and it was different enough that it really hooked me in, and overall really enjoyed this one. Okay, and then my last horror book that I read was 13 Stories by Jonathan Sims. This is a book I'm for sure going to be going into a more in-depth review on, but to basically put it simply, it is a story about, it's basically a group of short stories, and there's basically this massive complex, apartment complex. And this apartment complex was built by this basically super rich, disgustingly wealthy billionaire, gajillionaire more precisely, and he built a massive, beautiful, gorgeous, I don't even know if you can say apartment because it's not an apartment anymore, just this massive, insane house for himself on top of it. And then on the rest of the building, he basically built apartments. But he did something interesting. On one side of the building, he built really cheap apartments that are much more geared towards low income individuals, I should say, and people who are basically living paycheck to paycheck, and probably even more substandard than that in terms of the quality of living there. And then on the other side of the building, he built these massive, beautiful apartment buildings that are basically reserved for the wealthy and the high income individuals. And we basically follow 13 stories of people who live inside this apartment complex on the, for lack of a better terminology, rich and poor side. We follow kids, adults, older people as they basically start to experience really odd sensations, such as being followed by ghost figures, having imaginary friends that seem to actually be real. We have a creepy AI mechanism thing going on in one story, and you're basically just getting a whole bunch of different horror stories, and it all comes together in the final chapter where we get the point of view of the head honcho of the building, the gajillionaire who built this entire building and lives at the top of it. I don't want to say anything more than that for spoilers' sake, but it was really fun. It was kind of repetitive, I'm not gonna lie. Like, at certain points I was just getting tired of the amount of stories I had to get through to get to the end and figure out what was going on, but some of the stories were, of course, brilliant. Like, I really enjoyed, for example, one story where it was about a AI system that basically helps this bodybuilder, Instagram influencer slash like business leader through his daily life and his daily routines, and basically it turns on him. That was a really fun one, really enjoyed it. There's other ones, for example, the ones where the shadowy things follow this girl was less intriguing to me and was less captivating, but overall they're short stories, so even if you hate it, it's just a few pages, and if you love it, then it was a really sweet story, and it all comes together in a very satisfying way, which overall I can say that this is a book I enjoyed and I would recommend to people.